Welcome SSC 100 students. This is an unusual video and it's the second one for this week number 2 in our semester. I feel it's important to attempt to give an overview about types of knowledge because the essence of the social sciences is research, and research is all about empiricism and scientific knowledge. But scientific knowledge is only one kind of knowledge. So let me take you on just a brief tour saying that this information ought to be useful to you in your essays in this course and hopefully in your developing the course project, which is why I'm doing it. So let me take you first to the YouTube environment. Allow me to do that, because here's YouTube, and I want to show you that in YouTube there's a series on philosophy. Philosophy was the original home of the study of different types of knowing and knowledge. The technical word in philosophy is epistemology, E-P-I-S-T-E-M-O-L-O-G-Y. Means literally the study of knowing. And so it's helpful foundation for our understanding the difference between scientific research and, let's say, the inquiry. My favorite image here is, think about the inquiry done by a 1-year-old as she is exploring the nature of her toes. Is this scientific research? And one would say, well, maybe she's investigating something and certainly learning something, acquiring new understanding. And indeed, that is inquiry, but it is not research. So the distinction between inquiry and research, and more particularly the distinctions between data, information, and knowledge, are two sort of key concepts that I want to share with you. Again, these may be helpful in your explorations about social science research in preparation for your essays. In any case, if you want to learn about epistemology and types of knowing strictly from a philosophical point of view, then the crash course resources might be helpful to you. And if you'll notice on the opposite side of your screen is a video in this series called Science and Pseudoscience. And that's really what I want you to begin to think about in this introductory course. This is not a philosophy course, this is not an advanced course, certainly not a capstone course, but I want to introduce you to, number one, epistemology and the idea of different types of knowledge, as well as different types of investigation, ranging from inquiry to scientific research. Okay, so that's the first one, which is to say the crash course series and philosophy. Now, it's also important for us to distinguish between data, information, and knowledge. Any of you who are going into the computer sciences or business fields know that these are important distinctions. Those of you who are reading closely Kristen Luker's book know that we're in a world of info glut. And perhaps the most valuable lesson one can learn in this course is that information is not the same as knowledge. So I want you to begin thinking about these distinctions between data, information, and knowledge. In essence, data are just observations of, not just, it's quite a technical matter in its own right, but they're simply points in a data set, or bytes of information, if you would. Information is where you add the issues of language and meaning to your data. And finally, knowledge is where you develop from information knowledge that is valid, perhaps reliable, and useful. And that's really what the social sciences are all about. So concept number one was epistemology and types of knowing. Concept number two is this hierarchy that distinguishes between data, information, and knowledge. I'll also have these in this week's folder if you want to pursue these after this video. Finally, I am wanting to introduce you to one of my favorite applied social science philosophers, which is G.C. Hofstadter. 1970, he gave us, and myself in particular, a very useful framework for understanding scientific research, also called empirical research. What's the difference between empirical and scientific? I'll come to that. But in any case, these notes from a seminar in 2010 summarize rather nicely Hofstadter's types of knowledge. So let me very briefly walk through them with you, and then you can pull them up out of the weekly folder and look at them further and ask questions on the discussion board. So what this lecture basically is saying that way back in the old days, there were great philosophers, and great philosophers became great scientists through the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. And we're not going down into those areas unless you wish on the discussion board. But they are the foundations of the scientific method and the philosophy of science as we know it. So notice this definition of science is a process, not an accumulation of knowledge and or skill. Science as a process. That's what Kristen Luker is introducing you to. That's what this course is really all about. So first of all, let's put science into context. So I'm scrolling down here, and here's the scholar who I introduced you to, G.C. Hofstadter. You can look him up on the internet, and he identified 6 common methods of acquiring knowledge. Now, this lecture places a value judgment on those. My own values are not the same as this. I don't believe that some of these types of knowledge are good and others are bad. Rather, my own assumption is that they serve different purposes in different situations. So let's take a look at them briefly. The oldest kind of knowledge is, I think a young person today would sum it up by saying, I knew that. And tenacity, which literally means holding on, is accepting an idea as true simply because it's been around. Other people say it's true. Then it changes slightly, but if you're familiar with an idea, you tend to think of it as knowledge. If you're familiar with a belief, you think of it as true. And science is all about skepticism and the process of testing what we think is true knowledge. So here's the words for the essay that I'm hoping you'll think about in this course. Tenacity. The oldest form of knowing simply is something's true because it's been around. Intuition is the second form of knowledge. I'm a big fan of intuition, and we can talk a long time about the importance of intuition as it relates to intelligence and the scientific study of intelligence. In any case, for our purposes, Hofstadter's first 2 types are tenacity or familiarity and intuition. Notice the next is authority, that something is true because an authority says it's true. This is derived in the medieval times in Europe, and indeed in cultures around the world, that if a person of high status says something to be true, it must be true. So that's the third kind of knowledge. And each of these kinds of knowledge, of course, has deep, deep history behind it. But the only thing that you need to take away from this video are these 6 kinds of knowledge, or 6 ways of acquiring knowledge. So number 1, tenacity. Number 2, intuition. Number 3, authority. And we scroll down to the modern age. Now we get into philosophy and rationalism. Rationalism is all about logic. Something must be true if it's logical. And of course, a little bit of skepticism, looking at this, you'll see many logical things are not true. So it in of itself is a kind of knowledge, but a limited one, because logic is always limited by its assumptions. Now we get to the post-Renaissance era, when science began spinning off from the churches of Europe and North America. And empiricism is really where modern-day science starts. It builds on all the others, but empiricism means knowledge by observations. And observations, of course, mean data. So empiricism is knowing something because we have evidence. You'll hear a lot about evidence in the social sciences. And then finally, the distinction between empiricism and science itself. The problems with rationalism and empiricism is their limitations. So, as I said, rationalism is limited by its assumptions and definitions. Empiricism is limited by our ability to observe. Galileo, the famed inventor of a telescope back in the 16th century, was able to see things for the first time that nobody else saw, like features of the moon, simply because of technology. So notice the close connection between technology and the development of science, and we'll say more about that later. The point being is that science is this process over time of sifting out beliefs that we can validate from beliefs that we cannot validate. And I'll warn you right now that science is not either or. It's not black or white. I will tell you that much research, for example, has a degree of validity and a degree of reliability to its conclusions due to the fact that science is applied and done not just in laboratories. And one of the key distinctions that I will require you learning about is the difference between research and experimentation, particularly outside of the lab. And so if you look at the work of Luker or look at the work of Jane Goodall, who've been on our website, you'll see that good science is not the same as proof, is not the same as laboratories. And good science, it takes a longer time to really appreciate and I'll end on this point, and think critically about or critique or evaluate. So when we're, for example, studying the science of weather and meteorology, or the science of water and hydrology and the study of oceans, we're talking about dynamic systems. And hence, it's not a matter of proof. It's a matter of the most plausible conclusions based on, number one, the observations or evidence, and number two, the scientific process or the scientific method itself. I'm getting long-winded now, but these terms will show up in Luker, and so I recommend that you take a look at these rather well-written notes from this 2010 lecture, and then let's talk about them on the discussion board. I think it's very valuable to think carefully about the different kinds of knowledge and how that influences our ability to evaluate social science research. So thank you for your attention. The video is now 14 minutes long, and I appreciate your reaching the end of it with me. Welcome questions and discussion on the discussion board or at our workshops. See you soon.